Is a highly edited version of a 52-page analysis of OCD where cause is examined in a context that looks at OCD as being a consequence of how in general all humans through evolution have been designed to form conclusions. Specifically, this is part 1 of 4 parts in the 52-page analysis, where rigorous definitions which are part of the original paper have been omitted. The reader should infer from the text of this essay that those with OCD are really no different than those that do not have an issue known as OCD, other than those having OCD have an idiosyncratic emotive difference and perhaps are wired to strongly favor objective reasoning over favoring what is desired to be valid. This realization is likely largely not seen by people in general due to the not fully understanding how humans have been designed by evolution to form conclusions, and who largely see reasonable, irrational, etc., as that which they have accepted as valid through emotive favoring. Since definitions have been omitted in this abstract, please note that the author's definitions in the essay require real for the terms to be valid, and this then requires adjectives such as apparent, imagined, accepted be attached to the terms when guaranteed cannot in reality be determined. Beginning of abstract. Section 1s. Let me start with what I summarize OCD as, but to do this I need to ask you to follow along as I ask myself, how did evolution design us in terms of making conclusions, which are needed for decisions, which are needed for surviving to copy? Throughout this essay I will write of evolution as though it is a designer with purpose or aim. It is not, rather it appears to us like a designer with purpose or aim. However, it's easier to understand why you are what you are if we think of evolution as a designer with aim, simply because it becomes more abstract when it is detailed in a manner that coincides with reality. Since I find many people find my writing tough enough to comprehend, I don't aim to reinforce this notion, hence, evolution here will be treated as an engineer. If I was in a classroom I would call the engineer Fred or some other name, because what fun is coming to grips with our reality without a bit of fun. But evolution will do for this essay because, with an audience in attendance, I recognize I feed of the smiles generated by humor, but all I see presently is a Logitech keyboard. Let's go back to the question I asked myself, which simply stated asks, what is governing our conclusions given we are not savants, and why are we not savants? This is a conjugated question and I'll provide an answer for each, with the latter question answered first, but these answers are my conjectures and certainly not guaranteed conclusions. A. Why are we not savants? My answer is that, like man's attempt to create an airplane, where man did not start with a Boeing jet or the most complex machine man could dream of, rather, man started with devices that failed to survive trials, followed by devices that survived trials. Evolution has followed the same scheme simply because it's effective. Additionally, to survive to copy, which is the aim of evolution, requires only enough speedy processing power to handle the common everyday occurrences that the environment tosses at the animal. Hence, a slow but rigorous method of making conclusions has no advantage with respect to daily environmental encounters and simply will not be on the list of traits that has allowed the species to continue to propagate. What is on the list of required traits? Like it or not, the set of traits seems to be fighting, enough intelligence to handle common environmental hazards, gathering food by killing or some other means, having sex, and yes, the stereotypical fellow from a biker bar is an iconic representative of the main traits often required for survive to copy. Thankfully, the environment does not always require the traits of the fellow from the biker bar, otherwise my friends and I would be imaginary, but the environment has required the biker's traits enough that manifestations of these traits are not in short supply. B. Given we are not savants, are very intelligent animals that can derive guaranteed conclusions having no assumptions having been made in the process of forming the conclusion. How do we form a conclusion when this is vital in order to make a decision? To answer this question, let us look at what evolution gave us so as to effectively allow for what the question asks, and I'll present this as a list. 1. Evolution gave each one of us some ability to sense our environment and make an inference, meaning we have some capacity to envision B as either needed or needed and sufficient to have A. Therefore, we infer if A is desired, then B must be implemented. My dog Buddy is a wonderful example of another species of animal that has the capacity to envision and form an inference, where this was clearly demonstrated by it only took once for him to infer my grabbing the van's keys inferred his favorite thing to do, which is travel in the van, was imminent. 2. Evolution gave us a very strong emotive attraction to trusting our own analysis. Why? If the animal was wired to strongly trust implicitly the other animal, he or she would be the meal of the other animal. 3. Evolution gave the animal a very strong emotive attraction for favoring what our database of experience indicates as most likely, as also indicating validity. 4. Evolution gave the animal a very strong emotive attraction to favor the weight of envisioned supporting evidence as indicating validity. 1 through 4 in the list are a wired-in part of one's operating system that partly controls the animal's behavior and the rest of its set of emotions combined with 1 through 4, essentially for the animal, is their operating system that controls how they behave and therefore arrive at conclusions, much like Linux controls the computer's basic behavior. Like the Linux-based computer that comes off the assembly line, one has no ability to toss off their operating system in favor of another such as Windows other than what is allowed by the operating system, such as installing updates automatically is now allowed by Linux. Simply stated, animals are like the computer in that we cannot will our will, and there are many human animals that have an aversion to this because they emotively need to see themselves as superior to the rest of living life forms. Section 2s. Before I continue with my explanation or answer to the question of how do we form conclusions, I need to define 3 or 4 terms. In everyday use, these terms are not well defined and need rigor applied to the definitions, otherwise formal logic applied to or in conjunction with the terms is either impossible or at best not well thought out. I will again make a list and also include with each term why the term must, in my opinion, be defined as I did. I know reading or listening to definitions can be boring. To skip this section, one can turn to page 8, or if listening, skip ahead about 9 minutes and resume with section 3s. Balance of section providing well-defined definitions has been omitted in this abstract. Section 3s. With the 4 terms defined, I can now provide my answer to the question, how do we form conclusions which are required for making decisions, and I will present this as a flowchart in list form based on a concrete example. Basic flow of forming a conclusion. Example 1. 1. The animal senses objects in its environment as well as the concepts of quantity and numbers, and this leads to an envisioned question, which is, are all numbers ratios of integers, meaning, are all numbers in the form of A, B, where both A and B are from the set of positive and negative counting numbers. 2. The animal then examines his database of experience that consists of numbers of sheep, numbers of friends, how many sheep were sick versus how many sheep were in good health, and assembles his supporting evidence. 3. The animal trusts that he has not overlooked anything and that he is capable of seeing all required to answer his question. 4. The animal looks at his accumulated data and sees a zero likelihood for any number not being a ratio of integers and absolutely no mass of evidence supporting any number not being a ratio of integers, and behaves as wired, which is to favor weight of his evidence, his ability to derive answers, most likely derived from his experiences, indicates valid, which results in he favors accepting all numbers are ratios of integers, which he does, and I am fairly sure people of today would also form the same conclusion today were they not told differently during public school. End of example. As indicated in my first example, the set of 4 traits that I had enumerated several pages back were an integral part of arriving at the conclusion provided in the example. From this example, it seems everything I had listed as needed forms a viable scheme that allows the animal to form a conclusion. In this case, the conclusion was invalid, but it was formed nonetheless, and years ago, it was a conclusion that would have created ridicule in the minds of those having made the conclusion regarding those who had concluded otherwise. On the other hand, being able to sense the number of sheep one has, as seen in the example, has a lot more impact on the animal's daily survival than the question he had asked. Even today, simply being able to count sheep, money, apples, is all that the environment requires for surviving to copy. Thus, it is doubtful that human intelligence as a whole has changed in either processor strength in the last 2,000 years due to environmental needs since the days when the conclusion found in my example was seen as a valid answer. My first example that shows how conclusions are formed was in a sense pretty basic, for it had very little opportunity for other emotions other than favoring to influence the outcome. I want to provide another example, and in this example fear triggered by aversion will be allowed for and in a sense impact the outcome, and in a manner that is idiosyncratic to the specific animal. Before I show the second example, there is an important concept to be considered, and this has the form of the following question. Has evolution wired the animal to have fear triggered by aversion, assigned, or encoded a map to specific events or activities or encounters? Or has evolution wired the animal to have fear triggered by aversion being mapped to what is needed to have that which diminishes the chance of surviving to copy? What do I mean? I am saying, evolution could assign a map an aversion of. Thus fear of to the concept of being bitten by a snake that is poisonous, or evolution could have mapped an aversion of. Thus fear of to snakes in general, which is what is needed to have what is contained in the concept. I tend to think it is the latter, although specific acts or events may be included in the total package, and I say this because it would take far less encoding and processing power based on what is needed to have than an itemized list of many specific things that may or could be encountered prior to the animal making a copy of itself. If reality is as I have suggested, then what is feared? Is kind of a dumb question, isn't it? Why? Because the animal is simply responding as wired to respond to what is needed to have. Evolution found puts its life at greater risk, such as by encountering something such as a snake. The animal then responds as designed due to the hardwired aversion having been mapped to the snake for the animal, and fear is then triggered over the prospect of having realized what one has an aversion with respect to encountering, such as the snake. Simply stated, what is feared I expect is the snake, but the question I call dumb is often assuming there must be some downstream reason, personally selected reason other than the snake itself, and likely asking for it. The reason people presumably ask these dumb questions is because they are thinking in a frame of mind that places them as the emotively driven designer that, like the human engineer, designs with some downstream aim wanted out of every part of his implemented design. However, if they realized that evolution was the designer, not themselves, and evolution must work based on probability of occurrence as indicated by past occurrences, as well as evolution needs to design for survive to copy by providing a one-response-fits-all approach that maximizes survive to copy without having the ability to predict the future with other than the past, then fear all snakes was an excellent scheme to implement. Hence, asking of the individual why is often dumb due to a blind and perhaps arrogant ignorance of the structures involved. On the other hand, there are enough people who want to think that will can be willed, that perhaps some people really do think aversion and fear are unmapped choices for them to assign according to an emotively generated scheme of their own, and they probably are still waiting for the laptop to load up Linux on its own after the machine has grown tired of Windows. For the second example, I want fear brought on by aversion to be a component in the conclusion-making system, so I am using as a backdrop a day in the set of days leading up to the Second Gulf War that began in 2003 and resulted in overthrowing the government of Saddam Hussein. As before, I will place the conclusion-forming algorithm in list form because with minor differences this example and the first example have essentially the same structure. Example 2. 1. A. George envisions Saddam as having weapons of mass destruction in the form of an apparent possibility where either true or false is valid and asks himself if true is valid as a conclusion. Apparent possibility has two meanings, and the one that fits here is when an event being true or false cannot be ruled out, then being true and false both appear as possible outcomes in spite of they are not, and only one is valid, but which of the two is valid is unknown, leading to both true and false appear as possible. B. George is like all humans in that he is wired to treat apparent possibilities the same as real possibilities. C. George is human, and like all humans, George has hardwired to him an aversion with respect to his enemies having weapons of mass destruction. D. Additionally, all humans are wired to have fear triggered by either the prospect of acquiring what one has an aversion mapped to or the having as realized for themselves what one has an aversion mapped to. Y. Fear is the motivator that spurs one into either making changes that prevents the prospective and unwanted event from occurring or spurs one into removing one from its effects. Note, obviously, fear is a component heavily involved in this algorithm leading to a conclusion. 2. A. George looks at his own wants and desires and asks, what would I have were I to have Saddam's resources? I suspect he concludes he would have weapons of mass destruction, as in fact his country indeed has. B. George looks at the opinions generated by those that are assigned to access Iraq's intentions. C. George looks at the revenue generated by Iraq's oil fields and asks, can it support an endeavor involving what is being contemplated? 3. George trusts that he has not overlooked anything and that he is capable of seeing all required to answer his question of whether or not Saddam having weapons of mass destruction is valid. 4. George looks at his accumulated data from line item 2, and behaves as wired, which is to favor weight of his evidence, his ability to derive answers, which results in he favors accepting as true Saddam having WMDs, and he does so. End of example 2. Observations regarding example 2. I could have constructed this example differently, in which I had George form a different conclusion, i.e. not did WMDs exist on the day of George's conclusion, rather, is it true WMDs had been a possibility for being realized as true on the day of George's conclusion. The later is a different question, and honestly we don't know if WMDs were ever in reality in the sample space for being realized in Iraq. Additionally, we don't know if an affirmative to this last question is reasonable where real is required. However, I expect many would emotively favor reasonable as being valid, and they are doing so because they are favoring the weight of their experience as indicating valid. On the other hand, the conclusion of reasonable is not guaranteed, rather it is accepted where accepted is a very subjective end result and not always valid as indicated by example 1. I'd like to pause here and point something out that remains hidden without rigorous and well-defined meanings, such as what I created for possible, reasonable, etc. To start with, let me claim that no one has fear triggered by what lies outside of the set Z equals accepted as reasonable union true and false, with each cannot be accepted as ruled out. Why would they? For outside of Z implies not real. However, accepted as reasonable is not equivalent to reasonable where real is required, hence in fact people do fear what is outside T equals reasonable where real is required. Not just some people, but all people at one time or another fear what in reality is not reasonable. However, people tend to define reasonable as the definition I have provided, with instead of real being required they have favored and accepted by them as valid is required for the word's use. Frankly, I don't think they realize that they have taken a definition that is objective and have turned it by use into a definition that is subjective, or a definition given it matches what is strictly implied is one that is subjective, do you? Regardless, they are never seeing themselves as fearing some concept that is in fact invalid, for what they or anyone fears is never outside of the set Z. How can it be, for no one is wired to fear what they see is not real? Often in fact what one fears is outside of set T, but for oneself what is feared is always in the set Z. Thus they never see themselves as having an irrational fear, or unreasonable fear, when in fact they are having a fear of what is not real, or an unreasonable where real is required fear. Additionally, when what is feared, such as Saddam having had weapons of mass destruction, is shown to have been false, they still don't admit to having had an irrational fear, and through some rationalization they have clearly reserved the phrase to strictly imply a fear of what has not been accepted by them as being reasonable, or a fear that appears to them as unreasonable. This leads to they tend to believe only crazies have irrational fear. In the mind, how can this not be true, for they never have an irrational fear, because they like all never fear what lies outside the set of accepted as reasonable, which is a proper subset of set Z. This demonstrates itself rather nicely by the manual used in psychiatry and psychology clearly lists irrational fear as a distinguishing characteristic of those having OCD. In fact, irrational fear is a distinguishing characteristic of being human. I don't want to editorialize too much, and a part of me wishes to not do so at all. But, as one who has OCD, I can tell you that the ignorance of the author of the manual I referenced has portrayed those with OCD in a frame of reference that certainly is not flattering, nor is the so-called distinguishing characteristic really useful, and I doubt that the mind of the author was in the neighborhood of the mind of Stephen Hawking with respect to intelligence. Let's ask questions pertaining to example 2. What was feared by George? Answer: Saddam having exist in Iraq at his disposal weapons of mass destruction at the time of George's analysis. Was what was feared by George valid with respect to reality? Answer: no. Was what was feared reasonable where real is required? Here I am asking, did some X exist such that X was sufficient to guarantee Saddam having exist in Iraq at his disposal WMDs at the time of George's analysis indeed did exist as a real state of being? Answer: no. To summarize George's conclusion, we can say that George envisioned an apparent possibility where, through hardwired emotive favoring, he favored accepting the premise of WMDs being real within Iraq on the day of his analysis as being not only reasonable but true as well, and indeed he accepted both reasonable and true as being valid. In this summary of example 2, I need to bring up a subject that I prefer waits until I discuss language issues, but it needs to be a topic now as well as perhaps later. The topic is irrational. Analysis of irrational shows the concept to either be of a subjective nature or of an objective nature. For example, what was feared by George in example 2 was invalid where invalid is assigned as equivalent to irrational. On the other hand, when one says, having fear directed at something such as a non-poisonous snake is irrational, what one means is that the mapping of fear to is invalid for taking place, where this invalid is equivalent to one is emotively opposed to having fear mapped to. This later example of the use of irrational is the subjective irrational, and in my opinion our language should differentiate between the pair, but in use one often does not differentiate by using an adjective, most likely because it lessens the impact when one says subjectively or emotively irrational. To see other examples of subjective irrational, think of acting on choose to believe in a God that does not exist, or acting on choose to scratch an itch, where no long-term benefit can come from scratching the itch and infection is a likely consequence. Each of these taken as irrational is due to the speaker's emotive mind with respect to how they feel one should behave, thus each is subjective, rather than objective. To be objectively invalid, something needs to be false, where false is generated by reality external to the mind, such as 7 coinciding with the sum of 5 and 3 of the Earth orbiting the Sun in less than 365 days. With the preceding paragraph serving as a basis of understanding, we have something else occur with respect to irrational, and to explain this I need first to assign a definition to irrational. Let irrational be assigned to represent invalid, when invalid is not an emotive attitude. Okay, now I have given irrational an assigned meaning. As a mathematics student, I learned that a definition must provide all that is needed and sufficient for the symbol to act as a word and therefore map to something, indicating that the something being mapped to has associated with it what the definition requires for needed and sufficient. However, often, in use, we require something in addition to the assigned meaning for the word to be applicable. Thus, we have created a strictly implied meaning that differs from the assigned meaning by perhaps having an emotive attitude in addition to the assigned meaning needed for the word to be utilized. In the case of irrational, it can be shown that people will not use it to map to anything when to them the item of question appeared to them as reasonable or valid, in spite of in reality it was neither. Hence, we have two meanings for the objective variation of irrational, where one means invalid by being assigned this meaning and the other means by being strictly implied, accepted by the user as invalid. The first, irrational, has an objective meaning, the second instance has a subjective meaning. In general, when irrational is used, the user may intend the assigned meaning, but in reality what is being strictly implied by the user is the subjective meaning. Later, when I focus entirely on language, I will provide multiple definitions for meaning, but for now it is merely important to recognize the existence of what has been discussed. In closing this section regarding observations pertaining to George's conclusion, it can be observed that example 2 is essentially the same structure as example 1, with the difference being the addition of fear or aversion as a component that influences the conclusion. If one examines numerous examples of conclusions that have fear or aversion participate as a component of influence, the pattern that emerges is that when we start with an envisioned apparent possibility, the stronger the aversion for what is contained within the apparent possibility, it follows that we have the more that is required for true or false to be accepted by the individual as having been ruled out. Another way of saying the preceding sentence is, the more an apparent possibility is feared, the more that is required to accept as ruled out true or false. When true or false cannot be accepted as ruled out because the aversion is sufficiently strong enough to emotively require of the individual a guaranteed ruling out of either true or false, this sets the individual up for having the apparent possibility remain as an apparent possibility, thus giving him or her no exit from the fear associated with apparent possibilities, and this then is the basis of OCD. At this point in the essay I will remind the reader I had written I would summarize OCD, but I needed to provide the necessary definitions as well as understanding pertaining to how we form conclusions in order to do so. This has been accomplished. My summary of OCD is simply stated as follows. OCD is an emotive state of being that is brought on by an individual envisioning a concept that forms an apparent possibility having a component in the apparent possibility that has an aversion pertain to it that is sufficiently strong enough to prevent anything other than guaranteed false or true from being able to allow the observer, individual to accept that what is feared within the apparent possibility is ruled out as being valid. This then can lead to an endless period of anxiety when the aversion's status of T or F is either unanswerable or extremely difficult to ascertain with respect to true and false. Before I move off to the next major topic involving language, I want to provide another example that I have used in a prior essay. I then want to touch on one of my major issues, for its resolution may be of benefit to one that has never read any of my previous essays on the topic of OCD. The example I am about to provide is a favorite of mine because it allows women to easily feel the aversion associated with an apparent possibility and to then recognize a downstream consequence pertaining to fear is not always necessary for the genesis of OCD. Additionally, the example shows that ERP has its limit, and with this example I can also use it to show how one can conceivably generate a strategy that disarms the source of OCD. Section 4 SZOEY's example. Hypothesis. A. Let Zoe be a woman. B. Let Zoe have the thought women are inferior to men instead of Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. C. Zoe has higher than average intellect. The thought women are inferior to men is not actually the immediate trigger for fear, but is the source from which the trigger arises. The trigger that arises is one of the states from the thought taken as a question, where the states are true and false. For Zoe, true has an extremely strong aversion pertaining to it. As long as true or and false cannot be ruled out, for Zoe each appears as an apparent possibility, which I had defined as follows, with true being the actual trigger for fear in this example. Apparent possibility has two meanings, and the one that fits here is when an event being true or false cannot be ruled out, then being true and false both appear as possible outcomes in spite of they are not, and only one is valid, but which of the two is valid is unknown, leading to both true and false appear as possible. As I had previously stated, my conjecture is the stronger the aversion, the more that is required to assure yourself or accept that the threat has been ruled out. To see this, think of the 2016 Ebola scare in this country, where a university had taken an action regarding an employee of the university that they claimed in a news briefing had been made out of an abundance of caution. Had they used the same numerical probability associated with one subjectively calling fear of flying on an airliner irrational, they would have been calling themselves irrational. However, they used abundance of caution as a description for the behavior. They behaved as they did because those who made the decision had a far greater aversion to the horrifying death of Ebola and the effect a pandemic would have on the environment than falling from 30,000 feet while in an airplane for a duration of 5 minutes. The result of the comparatively large aversion to Ebola led to an idiosyncratic greater requirement for assurance that they and who they cared for would be safe. Hence, what in other situations they would call irrational, we have here it is being described as an abundance of caution. Zoe certainly has an aversion equal if not greater than the aversion associated with Ebola for the concept involving inferior in this example. As long as true cannot be ruled out, it remains as an apparent possibility, and we are all wired to treat apparent possibilities in the same manner we treat real possibilities. To see this, ask yourself what your emotive state would be if a police dispatcher called to tell you a loved one was in a serious automobile accident and on the way to an emergency room, and then broke connection prior to you asking which hospital. If the call had been an elaborate practical joke, what was being feared would not have been real, but since you are wired to treat apparent possibilities in the same manner as real possibilities, the reaction would have been unchanged. Zoe tries to rule true out, and she is seeing true and false as objectively determined, meaning she believes what is fitting for the answer is generated outside of the mind, much like 8 being right for 5 plus 3. Can you help her because she can't solve the question by arriving at a demonstrable conclusion, and the more she studies an approach to solving this puzzle, which is like a math word problem, the more complex it becomes, and her fear regarding the apparent possibility is growing, especially since it grows in complexity with respect to seemingly be able to solve. For the nearby man in Zoey's life, to him it is nothing to worry about or have a fear of, but then why would he, for he is male? To him he is only upset in that Zoey's trying to rule out the apparent possibility that has for her a huge aversion associated with the apparent possibility true, which triggers an equally large fear is upending what he wants them to do together. He is becoming upset, which places more pressure on Zoe, which then has a cascading effect of increasing anxiety to a level that is approaching panic. Without the ability to rule out an aversion when it appears as an apparent possibility, the mind will not lose having a fear of the apparent possibility until exhaustion sets in and sleep comes, with dreams involving the apparent possibility often being an integral part of one's sleep. From my own experience, this can last for 20 hours only to resume again when awake, where sometimes the apparent possibility that triggered the fear had been lost to memory and other times it picks up where it left off. If Zoe had less aversion to the notion of women are inferior to men, she might have been able to accept something as lame as what constitutes confirmation bias as sufficient to accept true was ruled out. Had this been the case, as soon as she accepted true as ruled out, the anxiety and fear would have evaporated in an instant. And for other women, this is either true that they have less aversion to the concept, or they easily accept what amounts to confirmation bias as sufficient to rule out true, rendering the concept far less of an issue. However, Zoe has a very strong aversion to the concept, plus she is a very strong math and science student, thus recognizes a pattern of reasoning that is invalid, which makes it very difficult to find the algorithm that deductively shows what she fears is indeed false. Let's help Zoe out. She needs to change her perception regarding true being an apparent possibility to true being false. Well, she has been trying to you, and she claims. Yes, but if it has an objective answer, it is almost surely unanswerable with respect to the human mind's capability, but it's actually a question that can only be answered in a subjective or emotive manner. Hence, the approach one needs to take is to believe in what is emotively in agreement with you, much like a faith in the God of your choice exists, which in Zoe's case would amount to believing the concept is false. It really does not matter in situations like this what in reality is true. What matters is what you believe, and like anything that is true, it is true regardless of whether one can show it's true or not. Hence, if you can believe in what you need to have, much like people of faith believe in God, the belief is every bit as effective as actually showing validity through an extensive logical proof. I know from first-hand experience this technique of relying on belief works well. It is what allowed me to progress from an undergraduate all the way to completion of graduate school, and without it I would not have succeeded. Section 5S. Observations regarding Zoe's example. The first thing I would like to point out is that unlike an aversion to neighbor's dog bites that leads to fear over the apparent possibility of being bitten by the neighbor's dog, where exposure to the source for the trigger of fear, aka as the neighbor's dog, will demonstrate that the apparent possibility is false, this is not possible in Zoe's case. An ERP approach will not be effective in Zoe's case simply because no amount of exposure to the concept "women are inferior to men" will demonstrate the fear that comes out of the concept as an apparent possibility is indeed false. Good luck with that idea, and if you believe differently, tell me whether 23,856,476,354,859,673,489 is a prime number is false by exposure to it after several hours, or days, or years. I would say ERP has its limits, and it's really on the therapist's shoulders once recognizing this to ascertain the nature of the aversion so as to gauge whether ERP can be effective. Next on my list of things to note is what is required by the idiosyncratic mind for accepting as true is very subjective. Additionally, what is required to accept a concept as true or false when it involves an aversion is almost surely governed by the degree of aversion, where the stronger the aversion, the more that is required for acceptance. People that fail to score 100% on all three of the math regents that walk around ridiculing those that have a strong aversion to something that then require perhaps as much as guaranteed conclusion to rule out the concept as an apparent possibility that is triggering fear need to write on a blackboard 10,000 times "I am really not that smart. I don't want to editorialize, but if there is one thing I disliked most, it was the smug look of superiority on the face of the other that had little to no aversion with respect to my trigger. While I missed a 100% on all 3 by 2 points, it really annoyed me to see the ignorance manifested by the remarks, especially because while it was hurtful, it served no real aim other than flattering themselves. Many aversions are not answerable, such as the aversion a woman had to her husband someday committing rape. For the women, the aversion is likely to be strong enough that unlikely is not sufficient to accept the apparent possibility as ruled out. The only real solution, unless you're a believer in willing one's will into being agreeable to change your emotive attitude with respect to the aversion, is allow belief to change your perception from it's possible to it is not possible at all, and it's really that remarkably simple in theory. In practice, I found at first it was tough, probably because I am designed to implement logic, but once achieved it became easier, and once the concept of using belief as your means of disarming the trigger takes hold, the aversion never grows bigger in scope by having examined it for a lengthy period of time, such as when one tries reason over belief to rule out apparent possibilities. Section 6S. My major aversion. I don't know how it took hold, and I assume I must have heard some religious fanatic on the radio, such as an Islamic fundamentalist preaching the rhetoric of evil and wrong behavior. For some reasons, including speech patterns, and I had never been encouraged to think that concepts like wrong and evil were in fact subjective and not objective attributes, lead to they were being viewed by me as similar to properties of the object, aka as constituent parts of an actor being committing an act. After hearing the rhetoric, I was sufficiently scared by how the fanatic portrayed those like myself that I wanted to show myself his conclusions were invalid. Otherwise, what was said by the fanatic became apparent possibilities for me that I had a strong aversion to. I became like Zoe in my previous example, and like Zoe's issue, which was actually a question that does not have either an objective true nor an objective false answer. Neither did mine, but I was thinking it did and trying to show I was safe from what I had an aversion for. In another paper, I created a metaphorical story in which a guy is told that if he finds himself in a specific room that contains a rabid lion, the only way to open the door into safety is by touching the tail of the lion while it was sleeping. The guy then awakes to find he was placed in a room that has a large sign pasted to the wall denoting "You are in the room of the rabid lion." Unbeknownst to the guy, the story of the lion was a total fabrication, but he never gets out of the room while being in constant fear of the lion, because he is believing in what is false and thinking he must touch the sleeping lion's tail before he can turn the knob on the door handle to release himself into safety. Why the story of the lion is fitting is because if you believe wrong is an objective attribute when in fact it is subjective, and in fact an emotive attitude, you will never be able to show by using logic in an objective setting that wrong is false and be able to free yourself from the fear brought on by seeing it as an apparent possibility. Once I showed myself wrong was subjective and could not be an objective property of the object, like rectangular is for the sheet of paper, or leafy is for trees, or green appears to be for grass, that feature of OCD totally disappeared. However, until then I actually once wondered if perhaps each step I took as I walked to my car was wrong, which triggered OCD, and to say it was an unpleasant experience is an understatement, and it's bringing back memories that are unwelcome. So I will close this section out with those that have issues with what is called a scruples variation of OCD need to realize that what they are afraid of, such as wrong and not wrong, wherein each wrong is being taken as an objective property of an object, are both imaginary. Section 7S. Observations regarding my aversion. If a magician is really skilled at his craft, then with speed of hand she can to the observer make the card in her hand look as though it disappeared from her hand, as in poof, it is gone. How can this happen? This is largely due to the same phenomenon that prevented Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Thales of Miletus, Pythagoras, and to not accept that a larger than the natural and integers and rationals numbers combined set of numbers existed. Many if not all of these fellows, at some point, ridiculed the idea of irrational numbers. They were the academics of the day, the cream of the crop, thus not dumb in human standards, and they were misled by their eyes. Plato and the others had plenty of through the eye confirmation for accepting the notion of discrete numbers that could grow larger and smaller through seeing with the eyes sheep arriving and departing. Conversely, they like you and I had no ability to, with the eyes, confirm the notion of approaching a point a number without ever arriving at the point as you passed across an interval of points heading towards the end point. Apparently evolution wired each of us to strongly favor accepting as real what through interpretation by the mind is derived from the data collected by our sense organs called the eyes. Simply stated, if the eye does not see it, then the mind accepts that it does not exist. Conversely, if the eye sees it, then the mind accepts that it exists. It is this last phenomenon that had tripped me up. Why? Well, just like every time my eye is actually detecting a 550 nanometer wavelength of light, my mind is modeling the light that was detected by the eye as green. I am a dumb animal that does not know green was added to the external data by mind, and in fact I am not seeing it as an external attribute of reality. But I think I am and have accepted the green of grass is an integral part of the grass. In fact, only the 550 nanometer light being redirected off the surface of the grass is external reality, and the rest evolution gave me out of appearing to have color somehow increases my odds of survive to copy. Similar to the 550 nanometer wavelength light is anything that rather than triggering the mind to add color to the model triggers the mind into generating an emotion or emotive attitude. Just like green, it is so easy to falsely accept that the emotive attitude being triggered is an external phenomenon being detected and an integral part of the object that has triggered the emotive attitude. Like the sleight of hand produced illusion from the magician, the human is convinced the emotive attitude is somehow an integral part of what he is observing. This scheme has pros and cons, and I don't really want to discuss either here other than the effect the scheme had on me. If I was considered as designed with an aim in mind, it was to utilize what is referred to as deductive logic to arrive at a conclusion of validity, and it should be no surprise to myself that I have a graduate degree in mathematics, and having done well in a field that only uses deductive logic in developing field theory is a bit of an understatement. Because of how my mind is wired to accept validity, if I am believing an attribute is an objective attribute of external to the mind reality, I will try to show validity according to objective reasoning where I want it to be true is not on the list of techniques that are utilized. Thus seeing wrong as an objective property of objects while emotively being at odds with perhaps the Islamic fundamentalist who is portraying me as essentially wrong with respect to behavior presented a real problem for me. Why? Well, both wrong and not wrong. Where wrong was being assumed or being taken as real with respect to being an external property of an object by me were in fact imaginary. Because both apparent states are imaginary, you and I simply cannot rule out either as being valid in an objective scheme of reasoning, and trying to do so creates the situation the guy in the room with the supposed lion had. Where this simply is you can never find what you need to exit the room, or in my case be able to accept an apparent possibility that has a strong aversion associated with it is false, thus have the fear being triggered abruptly end. It was absolutely critical that I came to understand what the preceding paragraphs disclosed for me to end issues involving scruples from serving as the basis for OCD. The difference is simply ineffable, so I will say no more. Why others don't have a problem with seeing emotive attitudes as objective attributes of the object being observed, I don't know for sure, But the ones I know that are strongly wired to see their emotive attitude as being an integral part of the observed object obviously are relying on what amounts to confirmation bias, and probably in spite of an ego's belief they would not be very suitable for forming conclusions in a setting requiring using purely objective logic such as mathematics. But they were not exactly designed to utilize formal logic either, for they have the traits needed for surviving in a crowd of animals that, unlike most animals, have the trait of killing each other, so it would be purely emotive to say which was better, but I know the form of perceiving is a disaster for myself. I had a friend who at age 17 went through a windshield and had his face peeled back. He survived and actually turned out to be a fairly handsome history teacher at a high school in Saratoga Springs, but for decades he was not too happy about being a passenger in a car. I kind of have the same reaction with respect to the idea of ever again letting emotive attitudes be taken as real properties of the object being observed. Why? The scheme was so ruinous and frightening to me when it was the source for OCD that I internally don't accept the false perceptions at all, and across the full range of emotive attitudes, simply because I never want to fall back into perceptions that place me in the room with the rabid lion and unable to exit. Since language is built around perceptions, in this case false perceptions, I had to examine language so as to not be leading myself back into a way of viewing the environment that, while fine for others, is not okay at all for me. All of this essay that follows this initial section examines language and identifies linguistic devices that are essentially problematic because of how they misrepresent reality and serve as a basis for OCD to arise from. In the section on language, what language consists of is first established prior to diving deeply into what for me is problematic representation, and at no point in the essay am I suggesting anyone should change the speech patterns, for as you will see if not already know, language is entirely subjective. End of Part 1's abstract.